Okay. Hello, audience, wherever you may hail. I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus. Join us as we explore some of Australia's and the world's most fascinating and important contemporary developments, shedding a spot of light in a world filled with alternative fact darkness. Today, we're joined by David Hutt, journalist, columnist, and political analyst, speaking about Cambodia and its eternal Prime Minister, Hun Sen. David, welcome to The Focus.
Thank you very much for having me.
David, can you tell us something about Prime Minister Hun Sen's early life? Where in Cambodia was he born and into what socioeconomic circumstance?
So Hun Sen was born in Kampong Cham province, which is northeast of Phnom Penh, the capital. He was born into relative poverty. His family, his grandparents had been successful landowners and successful peasant farmers, but they lost some money, and his parents' generation were relatively poor. He was one of the youngest of several children, but he was also seen as an exceptional child. So he was seen as an intelligent child, and because of that, he was afforded more education than his siblings. And from a very early age, he was sent to Phnom Penh, the capital, to continue his studies. He likes to talk about now as himself as a pagoda boy. So his family didn't provide him with money to stay in accommodation, so he had to stay in a pagoda and do the duties which are expected of that. So a very humble background. But again, there's lots of question marks about how much of a reality that is and how much of recent propaganda that is, making himself out to be a common man in touch with the soil, especially because most opposition challengers have come from very wealthy backgrounds. His main opposition rival, Sam Rainsy, was the son of a senior politician, lived in relative grandeur in Phnom Penh until his family were forced out of the country, and then spent their time in France, which of course is obviously more prosperous than rural Cambodia. And in the 90s, Hun Sen's other main rival was Prince Norodom Ranariddh, who was of course a prince, lived a very nice, lavish lifestyle as a child, also has French citizenship like Sam Rainsy. So there's always that bit of propaganda distinction between himself and his rivals.
It seems from what you've said that there is a big class distinction in Cambodia. Would that be true?
Yes, definitely through the decades as well. We have to remember that when Hun Sen was a very young child, that was when the communism was rising in Southeast Asia. He joined, it's not exactly known when he joined the Khmer Rouge, or what would become the Khmer Rouge. Officially, he says it was after the coup against Norodom Sihanouk in 1970. And Sihanouk was ousted by, let's say, a conservative middle-class bureaucrats within Sihanouk's own party or own government. And then once he was ousted, Sihanouk called on Cambodians to join the resistance in the countryside. And one of the main groups which were leading that resistance were the Khmer Rouge.
Right. Yeah.
And still on today, there's a very big economic divide in Cambodia. But of course, Hun Sen's government since the 1980s has perpetuated that divide, either through its economic policies or corruption or so forth. So the narrative of him being a man of the soil, a common man in touch with normal people, is also useful in that way.
And just on that, if I may, with regard to positioning himself as a man of the people, someone who had dirt on his hands, as he was growing up, so he could sort of relate to the poorer people within Cambodia. What can you say about Cambodia's middle class? I mean, obviously the wealthier elements who are playing politics in Cambodia must also be appealing to the, dare I say, lumpen proletariat as well. What is the thing that makes them popular? Is there a middle class that's actually viable in Cambodia that can give a sense of political authority to some of the more wealthier elites that are playing politics?
Today, there is a middle class. I mean, it's very small, and it's probably better to talk about middle classes. The big divide, the big dialectic in Cambodian history and even today is between the cities and the countryside. Of course, that's not exactly split on class, because you have very wealthy farmers in the countryside and very poor people in the urban areas. But politically, Cambodia is split between the countryside and the cities. The cities vote for the opposition overwhelmingly, and rural areas vote for Hun Sen's ruling party, the Cambodian People's Party. I think the middle classes, to some extent, accept the CPP, because traditionally the CPP, Hun Sen's party, and Hun Sen's government itself has typically stayed away from economics. So since the 1990s, it's adopted a very laissez-faire attitude to economic growth. It's trusted foreign experts, it's trusted domestic experts. The country's GDP has grown by more than 6-7% in many years. So it's had very healthy growth. Poverty rates have fallen considerably since the 1990s. And for most of the middle classes, as long as they stay away from politics, then politics kind of stays away from them. And that has always been Hun Sen's pledge or promise or threat, to allow us to do what we want to do in politics, allow the tycoons and the politically connected business people to do what they want to do economically, and we'll leave you alone. So don't complain, and we'll guarantee you some economic growth.
That sounds very Chinese, dare I say, in the way that they have structured themselves. If we return to Hun Sen's early career, while he was in Vietnam serving in the Cambodian resistance to the Khmer Rouge, what can you tell us about Hun Sen's military career? Was it a distinguished one?
Again, that period of his life is not very well known and remains controversial because of ongoing investigations over other people within the Khmer Rouge and the atrocities they committed. So he left the Khmer Rouge in 1977 when a purge was coming to what was the Eastern Zone, which was his zone in the east of Cambodia. And him and some fellow Khmer Rouge officers, they say, had grown disaffected with the Khmer Rouge, had grown angry at its atrocities, and wanted to rebel. This was obviously at a time when the Khmer Rouge was launching its own attacks against Vietnam. So escaping across the border, which wasn't too far from where he was located in the Eastern Zone, was an easy option. He was a middle-ranking general at the time, so nothing prestigious. And very much when he arrived in Vietnam in 1977, up until the Vietnamese invasion in 1979, January 1979, people didn't think that much of him. He was very young. He wasn't as seen as politically or just in terms of practicality that experienced. Other people were far more experienced who had left the Khmer Rouge with him and fled to Vietnam. But I think that the Vietnamese definitely took him under their wing and saw something in him, provided him a lot of training. So one of his mentors was the Vietnamese envoy who was put in charge of administering the new Cambodian state after 1979. He quickly became a foreign minister at a very early age. And then because of certain schisms within the new party, which ran Cambodia after 1979, as well as some support from Vietnam, and also because of his own will to get ahead, by 1985, he had become prime minister. I believe at 32, he was 32 years old, so very young.
Yes, indeed. So if we go into the political aspects of when he first became prime minister, what actually explained the falling out between Prince Norodom, Ranariddh, and Hun Sen, which led up to the 1997 Cambodian coup?
So that's a very long and complex part of Cambodian history. So in 1993, after the Paris Peace Accords, the UN came in to administrate Cambodia. Free and fair elections were held in 1993. There was still, the Khmer Rouge was breaking apart, but it was still active in resistance, or whatever you want to call it, in the western parts of Cambodia. And in the 1993 election, Prince Norodom Ranariddh's party, which was called Hun Sen, actually won. So it came first, and this was unexpected. So the CPP, as it became renamed in 1991, Hun Sen's party, basically refused to accept that result. So some people within the party threatened to take some provinces in succession. Hun Sen made some other threats, and eventually it was agreed that Hun Sen and Ranariddh could be co-prime ministers, and power would be shared between the CPP and Hun Sen.
So like a grand coalition?
Sort of, yeah, but a very awkward coalition. Both still had their own militias. There wasn't really a national army. So they had the militaries who were loyal to either Hun Sen or CPP. The ministries were also divided up between the parties. Some had co-ministers, but obviously the CPP ministers had been in power since 1979, so had more authority and more connections than Hun Sen. There were also problems within the CPP itself. So Hun Sen's power within his own party was relatively weak at that time. There were people who wanted to remove him. There was ostensibly an attempted coup in 1994 against Hun Sen, and another a few years later. We don't really know exactly what happened. Who was the main actors? Was it Hun Sen trying to remove Hun Sen? Was it rivals within the party, within Hun Sen's own party, who wanted to remove him? But basically it coalesced to 1997, where Hun Sen finally had enough, forcibly removed Hun Sen from power, and also asserted his own authority over his party. So there were some within the CPP who are known to have opposed this coup, who refused to allow their own militia or associates from taking part. But Hun Sen had done this very well. So he managed to get Hun Sen out. Ranariddh went into exile for a few years before Hun Sen tempted him back with a pardon and then a new promise for a new coalition. He managed to get out lots of his own rivals within the party and put his own, firstly, family members, but then key associates into key positions, not just in the government, but in the government-aligned NGOs, which are quite considerable because they have a lot of power over business and connections in high society. And he was able to get his family members into very high positions. So this not only consolidated the CPP's control over politics, but also Hun Sen's control over politics.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was a very complicated bit of history to go through, but you did a great job in simplifying that. So thanks for that.
That was a basic interpretation as well.
No, brilliant, brilliant. Look, David, can you explain Hun Sen's longevity? I mean, you've painted the picture of how he took power, but I mean, is he actually a popular Cambodian figure? Is that what really can account for his longevity, or is he just a cunning bugger?
He's a bit of both. So the first thing you have to understand about Hun Sen is he's a very protean figure. He has very few positions on policies. He's managed to change he's managed to change between positions very quickly. So he went from Khmer Rouge to anti-Khmer Rouge, then to the leader of a socialist light government in the 1980s, then to the architect of a very pro-market sort of democratic system in the 1990s. He doesn't really have any positions on individual policies. He's very good at adapting or adopting other people's positions which seem popular. So we've just seen in the last decade or so the minimum wage for garment workers, who are the biggest workforce, or the most important workforce economically anyway. This was a position which was advanced by the opposition in the 2013 election, proved very popular. And within months, Hun Sen had adopted that position, and now the minimum wage in the last 8 years has tripled almost. So he's very good at that. I think he has a very good political instinct of knowing his weaknesses of his rivals, knowing when to make moves, but also knowing how not to destroy your enemy, but how to leave them weakened so that they can become malleable and useful. So after the 1997 coup, Ranariddh was overthrown, but then Ranariddh was invited back with a pardon. And Hun Sen said, no, we want to be friends. After the 98 election, they again entered a coalition, which ended badly again, although not to the same extent. And then Ranariddh again went into coalition years later. So he's very good at co-opting. He's very good at using his rivals. He has been blessed by having somewhat weakened rivals as well. So Ranariddh has many problems and many failings. He's very egotistical, and his desire for power is very overt and can be used in very easy ways by Hun Sen. Sam Rainsy, who's been the main opposition rival since the late 1990s, he's a much more capable politician, but his own parties have numerous problems. Personally, he has numerous problems with dealing with his own allies in the opposition. So Hun Sen has had some success with that. But the last thing is, Hun Sen can actually point to genuine successes in Cambodia. He was in charge when the civil war, which lasted for almost 3 decades, came to an end in the late 1990s, in large part because he was able to co-opt the remaining Khmer Rouge leaders to turn on Pol Pot and to come into to accept a compromise with the new government. He has overseen 3 decades of amazing economic growth and change in Cambodia. How much that is directly related to his government, or how much that would have just happened because of outside changes, is debatable. But he can genuinely point to some successes and some very big ones, especially this year with the pandemic. Cambodia is probably the most successful country in, not the most successful. Singapore has a higher vaccination rate, but Cambodia has the second, which is surprising considering its wealth. So he's been lauded a lot for that, and his government deserves praise for how it's handled the pandemic, and especially the vaccination. Yeah, so I think it's a mixture of many different things. His political skill and his political instincts are one of the best in terms of how he's able to use, how he's able to abuse, but also his timing of knowing when his enemies are weak and which allies to form with. Yeah.
So I read somewhere that Hun Sen says that he wants to be in power until he's about 74. Now, depending on what you read, he's either 69 or 70 currently. Do you think he's got a very good chance of being able to just, keep on top of the process until such a time as he wants to retire?
Health aside, obviously he is advancing in his years now. And no one knows exactly what his health is like, but it doesn't seem to be a problem at the moment. I think he could realistically stay in power for as long as he wants. The question is, with all dictators or autocratic leaders, is how you manage that succession process. Yep. So there's either, it is very debatable in Cambodia right now because it's a very sensitive topic, and Since the government has become increasingly authoritarian since 2018, it's very hard to get that much information out of senior figures. But there seems to be three general thoughts on potential succession and when Hun Sen would retire. So up until last year, it was basically assumed that he wanted to hand down power to one of his children, the likely candidate being Hun Manet, his eldest, who is the de facto military chief at the moment, and has taken on lots of his social responsibilities of going to pagodas, does a lot in the government-aligned NGOs. He's very big in business circles. And that was taken as almost fait accompli up until last year, when it became known that some people within the CPP didn't want that outcome. They were wary that a new young generation would come through with Hun Manet and put themselves out of power. I mean, there's people in the CPP senior leadership who are now in their late 70s, or at least in their 70s, and many of them no doubt think it's their time to rule, or it's their time to have more power, or that with Hun Sen's family getting a nod, that their own family members and associates would probably lose out if Hun Manet came through. So there's general chatter about the Central Committee of the CPP having opposed, or at least made it known that it opposes a dynastic handover. So the question then turns to whether Hun Sen tries what is called the Singapore model of handing power to a moderate figure who then rules for 5-10 years before handing power over to Hun Sen's son when he has a bit more experience and a bit more trust within the party, or whether there's open conflict within the party as someone else tries to remove him. Lots of people talk about the interior minister as Sarkeng is having the most authority in the party after Hun Sen. But that's a very open question right now, and either it will be a peaceful succession or it could be very brutal and violent.
I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast, and we're speaking with journalist David Hutt on Cambodia and its leader Hun Sen. David, can you tell us something about land and human rights issues under Hun Sen's leadership?
Well, they're not very good, and they haven't been very good since the 1990s. Partly that is because of how the structure of the political system in Cambodia works. In the 1990s, there was a lot of devolved power. The state wasn't as strong as it is now. Lots of provincial figures held vast power. Lots of business tycoons who made their money during the socialist years of the 1980s became very, very powerful in the 1990s. And Hun Sen's government had to work with them. And they couldn't, at that point, they didn't have the authority to temper the actions of the tycoons. So lots of it stems back to the 1990s. It also stems back further because of just how land right issues were dealt with after the Khmer Rouge. There was obviously, most people were forced out their homes, at least from the cities, or at least from the area surrounding the cities. And in the 1980s, there was a rush back, and many people just took land where they could. They didn't have to. There wasn't the system or apparatus to apply for land deeds or land titles at the time. So it was a very confused picture of land ownership and land entitlement getting into the 1990s when the new Cambodian state was forming. Then there's the government itself, and there's a distinction. You mentioned China earlier, and I think this is the same for many developing countries in Asia, is the battle between respecting rights and trying to ensure economic growth as quickly as possible. So you see this in Laos especially, but it's in Cambodia too, that if a country as a whole wants to have 6, 7, 8% growth annually, then certain areas are going to, or certain corners are going to have to be cut, basically. So if you want to build a factory in this if you want to build a massive SEZ, a special economic zone in a certain rural area, do you have the time, if you want to achieve 6% economic growth, to go through the process of land rights? And it appears, because of what's happened, that the government and the authorities have said, no, we're going to prioritize economic growth, and we're going to downplay the potential side effects of that. That's more about land rights. About human rights, it is a far more easy picture, which is the Cambodian government will respect human rights up until a point, and it's constantly changing. So in the 90s, there was very little respect for human rights. But in the 2000s, early 2010s, that slightly changed. There was more free speech. The trade unions became very big and important and very vocal. Lots of NGOs were created. There's a lot of foreign involvement in Cambodia. As a journalist, when I arrived in 2014, there were at least 3 English language newspapers and hundreds of journalists, foreign journalists in Cambodia, which is not the case in most other places in Southeast Asia, particularly in mainland Southeast Asia. So it's a shifting issue. But since 2017, 2018, when the opposition party was forcibly dissolved, and then the ruling party won all the seats in parliament in 2018, it has taken an authoritarian turn. Human rights have suffered. There's very little free speech now. Protests are not tolerated. The government's been able to more stringently crack down on social media to crazy and very depressing ways. A random person, a common person, writes one comment on Twitter or Facebook, and they can be in prison for 3 years. This is not someone who is a well-known activist or someone who is even that influential. It's just a very random, brutal, and very sad way of, the French say, pour l'encourager the result, to encourage the others. They'll take one example and that will be used to set an example for other people. This is what you can't do. This is the limits of what you can say, what you can do.
So, David, I gather by what you've just told us, corruption is a massive problem in Cambodia. It's not something that's easily controlled.
No, the government says it's trying to crack down on corruption, and in some instances it has, because I think Hun Sen and others have realized, one, how much of an economic impact it has, but also because it kind of disrupts the system. There's good corruption for the politicians, so they know who their allies are. But then if someone else has their corrupt networks, then that can destabilize the power of some senior leaders. It's a very corrupt system in Cambodia. It's because there's very little democratic tradition or democratic process in the last 3 decades or so. Most politics is hierarchical and seen as patronage. So it's who you know. If you know someone, if you're an ordinary person and your family member is a policeman or a civil servant, then you get certain benefits. It's easier to cut lines. It's easier to contact people. I think in the early days in the 90s, there's some justification that maybe corruption eased the transition. It eased the capitalist free market transition. The companies came over. If they paid a small bribe, they could start a business very quickly. And there's some justification for saying that was tolerable in the early 1990s, or not even the late 1990s, when the mechanisms of a state were just growing. But now, when the mechanisms of the state have been developed, when there is a modern bureaucracy, now it has become intolerable for most people. And it's perpetuating this idea that of a great wealth inequality, but also inequality of opportunity in Cambodia, and that's what's very jarring for many people there.
So let's look at Cambodia's foreign relations. How would you describe China's relationship with Hun Sen? I mean, after all, it was the People's Republic under Mao who supported the genocidal rule of the Khmer Rouge, which killed approximately 2 million Cambodians. Is all forgiven?
Pretty much. Hun Sen and China now call themselves, I believe it's ironclad friends. They have a new slogan each year. So the China supported the Khmer Rouge and backed the Khmer Rouge. It also opposed Hun Sen's government in the 1980s because Hun Sen was backed by Vietnam, obviously the enemy of China at the time. But since the mid-90s, Hun Sen has opened up to China. As I said, he's a very protean figure. He's able to shift his positions very quickly. So in 1995, I believe he made a first visit to Beijing. It might have been 96. And then very quickly, his coup happened against Feng Sipek. And China came out and defended Hun Sen on the international stage when America wanted to sanction it. ASEAN delayed Cambodia's joining of a bloc, and China then showed itself could be an ally of Hun Sen when he was at his most autocratic. But that kind of stalled for the next decade or so. It was really in the early 2010s that China became a significant partner for Cambodia. Up until then, the vast majority aid, the vast majority trade and investment had come from the United States, Japan, Australia, European countries. Hun Sen's relationship with America had always been fractious at best. There was no love for Hun Sen within the US Congress, but Washington basically tolerated Cambodia. I believe Obama was one of the first presidents to visit Cambodia since the 1980s, and he only done so when Phnom Penh was holding a summit in 2015, 2014 maybe. But then Hun Sen saw that China could be very important for his country's economic growth, and China saw that Hun Sen's Cambodia could be a good partner in its own backyard. And things began to massively deteriorate in early 2017 when Hun Sen's government unilaterally suspended an upcoming joint military operation with the United States. It claimed this was because soldiers were needed for a local election that year, but that seems spurious. And then it engaged in joint military drills with China. So since then, it hasn't engaged militarily with the US and has received a lot of aid investment from China. China has defended Hun Sen's government on numerous occasions at the UN and in international meetings. So at the moment, Cambodia is very much stuck between the US and China. Washington is still asserting, or at least diplomats close to Washington are asserting that Cambodia plans to allow Chinese troops to be stationed on its soil. This has been reported since 2016, 2017. Yep. And Phnom Penh and Hun Sen vigorously deny this, although China is now building new stations at the Ream Naval Base, which is Cambodia's main base. And I can't really see any change in this dynamic. Washington isn't going to let go of its belief that Cambodia is now the main ally of China in Southeast Asia. It makes little sense for Hun Sen to completely roll back to America. The amount of investment and trade it gets from China is considerable, and also the amount of protection. So its foreign policy is very much stuck in this gray area between the two. And there's obviously some dissent within Hun Sen's own party that maybe they went too pro-Beijing and need to roll back to America. But it's a complicated issue and not one that can be easily solved for any of the three sides.
I'm actually curious now that we've covered that, because I mean, here we're talking about government to government relations. And, you know, obviously the elephant in the room when we all talk about Cambodia's history is the Khmer Rouge and the genocide. But how is it between the Cambodian people and the Chinese people? I mean, is there any level at which the Cambodians remember the Chinese in terms of its support for the Khmer Rouge? Or is it all at that sort of elite level and everyone's so busy getting on with their lives that they're quite happy to forget?
I always say that Chinese foreign policy is its own worst enemy. And since it started to pump considerable investment into Cambodia from around 2015, 2016, you can notice very easily a massive spike in anti-China sentiment amongst Cambodians. Sihanoukville, which is a coastal city in the south, was the main hub of Chinese investment, particularly in casinos and in the tourism sector. And from around 2017, Cambodians began speaking of it as China City. The prices were rising, locals couldn't afford to live in the city anymore. Many people started to say, this isn't Cambodia anymore. There were some attacks on Chinese nationals. I was there at the time and speaking to Chinese nationals, and many felt quite insecure and unsafe being in Cambodia. So it's not so much about the memory of the Khmer Rouge, because that was such a complicated history of who was backing it, and many Cambodians would prefer to let that period of history go. So the love-in for China in Cambodia is very much a elite business or political thing. I wouldn't say there's too much fondness of China amongst most ordinary Cambodians. Obviously, they appreciate the investment that has come, but also they're very negative of the fact that lots of Chinese investment or projects in Cambodia are done by Chinese workers who are shipped in. So it's not seen as benefiting the local economy. There's been a sharp rise in prices in many cities. And also a social side, you know, because lots of Chinese visitors come for gambling or for other tourism purposes, and they're seen as downsides of crime and, you know, mess on the streets or things like that. So yeah, it's very much an elite sentiment towards China at the moment.
And finally, David, what are Hun Sen's relationship with other Southeast Asian leaders like?
This is an interesting question, because next year, Cambodia takes on the chairmanship of ASEAN for the year. And in private, lots of other Southeast Asian leaders, especially in maritime Southeast Asia, so Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, Malaysia, are quite concerned about what Cambodia will do as the bloc's chairman. Cambodia in the past, in 2013, blocked a statement by ASEAN against Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. On several other occasions, it's seen as coming to Beijing's defense within the regional bloc. So there's some apprehension about whether Cambodia will do this again next year, whether it will try to stymie or delay any statements or policies from ASEAN which are seen as hostile to China's interests. In terms of its neighbors, Hun Sen's relationship with Vietnam is very strong, obviously because of history. Recently, there was a meeting between the leaders of the ruling parties of Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, which hadn't happened in many years. That's the three old communist parties. The Hun Sen CPP was a socialist party created in 1979 by the Vietnamese, but dates itself formally back to the 1950s. I think there's some apprehension from Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia about what Cambodia wants to do. But the ASEAN way of non-interference in other countries' affairs, means that other Southeast Asian leaders are a bit reticent about criticizing what's happening in Cambodia. Although a few years ago, there was a minor spat between Cambodia and Singapore over past debt, and lots of angry tirades were exchanged between the two relating to what happened with the Khmer Rouge. So there is tensions over, there is some tensions with their neighbors. The big question is Myanmar and what Hun Sen is doing about that. You would have seen that the junta leader in Myanmar was banned from the upcoming ASEAN summit later this month. And I believe that Cambodia was one of the 4 countries which were accepting of the junta leader coming. And there was a big split within the ASEAN bloc over whether that should be happening or not. So again, it's tense, like Cambodia's relationship with China and the US and other partners, EU and Japan, but also with its neighbors. Its close relationship with China has caused it problems. And Hun Sen, over the next few years, especially as economic growth is going to be the hardest problem he has faced in decades, maintaining good relationships with his neighbors and trading partners is going to be key.
Sure. David, thank you very much for your time and for your insights on The Focus.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Journalist, columnist, and political analyst David Hutt on Cambodia and Prime Minister Hun Sen. That's it for this episode. We hope that you enjoyed the show. My thanks to our guest, David Hutt, and to producers Neil Smart and Malcolm Hughes. Thanks also to the Ozcast Network. You can find The Focus on the Sage International website at sageinternational.com.au, the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. Until next time, it's goodbye from me, John Bruni.